The electoral campaign for the 2019 European elections did not take place in a vacuum so far as similar forms in Legion countries called to vote. While there are ample signs of discrepancy among the 28 European nations, each of which is marked by certain specificities and idiosyncrasies. In the time following the regulations of political campaigning and the electoral laws, a variant use of TV ads in private and public television has come to pass, ending with the different possibilities of exploiting public or commercial spaces to present the posters. A further element of difference is the coincidence of the European election with other elections in many countries, thus affecting the tone and the topics of the European elections campaign. Should this be the case of Belgium, Italy, Denmark, Finland, Greece, Lithuania, Romania, and in particular Spain, with a record of 5 elections per month, besides the concurrence with presidential, general and local elections or referendum, appeals to support the level of participation in voting and reducing the abstentions on the one hand, and distracts the election campaigns from Europe and European topics on the other. Not the supranational campaign. It is necessary to note that the distinct national electoral campaigns evinced by then a low degree of internationalization. Out from 1,000 of materials collected in diverse countries, the presence of European campaigns or the contents examined at the supranational level was hardly detectable. With regard to electoral communication, one important aspect has proved that national identities are more prevalent among the European political affiliations. Indeed, a trend that did not seem obstructive in 2014 was the designation of candidacies by the European political parties concerning the role of Commission President. A significant section of the European Elections Monitoring Centre website has collected all the electoral materials produced by them. Only a few of the European executed campaigns, however, left no stone unturned, but to converge on themselves and engage in electoral tours across the various countries. The impact of social network. Considering the number of materials produced by the 300 European political parties, a paradigm shift in the instruments of the campaigning seems to be evident. As a matter of fact, social networks, whose web service represents the biggest news of the electoral campaign, effectively outclass the traditional posters as well as the more recent TV commercials. Given the range of issues encountered, it is worth noting that the exhibition of the electoral posters in the streets during the campaign is not allowed as in some countries like Estonia, whereas they are permitted in Italy, for instance. The use of these posters has been gradually degrading in favor of the social network. Despite delay, there are nations in which posters remain a central tool of the electoral campaign, where the parties produce many of them, such in Germany. Another relevant evidence that is equally highlighted in the current research is a remarkable presence of differences in the production and use of social network among the 4 geographical areas and political families. 2 weeks before the vote, the electoral campaign still had an obstacle taking off. It was only in some countries that we could possibly talk of an intense electoral campaign, whereas in the majority of other nations, European campaigning was barely perceptible. In this way, we might conceive it as holding a low-intensity degree. The prevalence of domestic themes over European ones was a general trend in almost all countries. The topics discussed by the political parties and their candidates, along with their declination and viewpoints, were mainly national. For example, we can take the case of immigration, which despite it being potentially supranational, while depending on European politics, laws and choices, was frequently discussed within the limits of its domestic consequences and/or relapses, as in Hungary and Italy. Environmental topics, by contrast, were usually dealt within a supranational dimension. Apropos, the macro themes investigated further during the elections campaign, ranking Europe at the top of the chart, a somewhat predictable result, shows that sub-items are prone to be different from each other, like national values and solidarity, and economic attributed to taxes, inflation, crisis, banks and the like. We can also take into account the environmental macro theme that involves specific themes as climate change, energetic issue, and environmental sustainability. Environment and immigration having inaptly lower values than expected, depict a marked geographical characterization. While the immigration-related issues are more present in the Eastern Europe elections campaign, the green ones, nevertheless, are strictly related to Northern and Western Europe. In spite of being characterized by great activism and a significant presence of Eurosceptic feelings alongside the Eurocritic parties, the most powerful forces in the electoral campaign were strongly antithetical to Europe than to other nations. From a quantitative perspective, the 2019 European elections campaign, therefore, was not dominated by the propaganda of the Eurocritic or Eurosceptic motives. During the European election campaign, scholars in the EEMC network collected around 12,556 campaign messages. The vast majority of them were scrapped from 193 official party accounts on Facebook in the 28 member states of the EU. In this way, the 2019 European elections can be considered as a social media election campaign. The parties spent both extensive time and resources on their social media accounts, posted and shared web cards, webcasts, pictures and videos. Even so, more traditional campaign channels are still commonly used, whereby election posters and even newspaper advertisements play a significant role. More than 1,000 posters and press ads were collected across Europe during the last 4 weeks of the campaign. Television commercials, likewise, act out in countries where political communication is privileged, yet they are prohibited in some of the member states. Due to high costs, some parties also opted out of this campaign channel in the European elections of 2019. Social media posts outnumber other ways of campaigning in all geographical areas and all member countries. The use of Facebook as a campaign tool seemed to be most accentuated in Southern Europe, where we explore the highest activity in Italy and Portugal. Southern Europe also differs in as much as television commercials are more frequently used compared with posters and press ads. Correspondingly, the current situation is dissimilar in other parts of Europe. The campaigns in the United Kingdom and Greece were carried through without printed political propaganda. Instead, Greek parties put great emphasis on television, publishing over 87 commercials during the campaign. No other country could reach that number, even if the use of television commercials was extensive in Portugal, Germany, Poland and Hungary. In brief, there are differences within countries that might be dependent on legislation and traditions of political communication, even though there is a similar picture of campaigning for Europe. On a more general level, the European campaign had at least a national 36.3%, if not a comparing and contrasting perspective with 32.9%. It is apparent that 1/5 of the campaign appeals focused on Europe and European prospects, where only a small share, 1.5% of the campaign content, could be categorized, having a different outlook of searching outside the EU. But there are significant differences if we compare different parts of Europe and those single countries. In truth, campaigns in Eastern and Southern Europe tend to be more nationally oriented or contrasting national and European dimensions in the appeals. In Western, and to some extent in the Northern Europe, we find more campaign messages with an exclusively European perspective. As been pointed above, there are significant differences between single countries when considering the various dimensions of the campaign. Countries like Bulgaria or Portugal have almost no appeals with a European perspective, while the campaigns in Belgium, Luxembourg and Sweden would have an intricate focus on Europe. The most nationally oriented campaigns actually are found in Lithuania, Croatia, Portugal and United Kingdom, where more than 50% of the content had a national perspective. Countries where the campaign emphasized European dimensions on the other side have had quite naturally a less national-oriented campaign. In this regard, the Belgian campaign can be seen as the most extreme, where there is no single appeal found with a national dimension. A large part of the campaign contents of the EU elections had either no clear representation of Europe, with 31.3%, or simply a neutral assessment, having solely 23.1%. This means that a majority of the campaign messages did not evaluate Europe, EU at all. When addressing positive and negative perspectives, there are 3 times as many messages with 34.2% of positive perspectives on Europe and EU than 11.4% of assessments being more critical. This picture seems to be familiar in different regions of Europe in terms of the positive share towards Europe. One remarkable difference between the regions can pertain to the question of whether both Europe and EU are represented negatively. It appears that 1/5 of all campaign messages view Europe from a critical light, perceived with negative assessments of Europe in Western and Northern Europe. Eastern and Southern Europe are to be disparaged on the margin of the scale, where negative representations of Europe are rarely examined. So even if predictions of the EU elections argued over a landslide of Euroscepticism, the campaign seemed to be more pro-Europe than anti-Europe. When representations of Europe are analyzed, there are to be sure differences detected. In most countries, assessments being more positive towards Europe are in majority. Yet we only find small shares of negative representations of Europe and a vast majority of appeals presenting Europe as something positive in countries such as Cyprus, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Romania and Slovenia. In other countries, the share can be recognized even between negative and positive representation, like France and Malta. In addition to that, there are countries where EU and Europe are viewed in a predominantly negative perspective, as the United Kingdom, which is also the case for the campaign in the Netherlands and Denmark. The negative evaluations of Europe are more common than the positive ones in the Czech Republic too. The most common issue of the European elections campaign was Europe, with around 15% out of the total amount of the topics covered. In the broadest sense, we can assume that there are a lot of subcategories, like appeals about the EU economy, the euro, and more general aspects of the European Union, such as treaties. Added to these issues, we have also spotted more critical views on EU, such as anti-EU, Brexit, and content-covering discussion about another EU and EU integration. In many countries, Europe dealt with a discussion about the country's position and future role in the EU. On the next level of the covered issues, there are values, economic issues, social issues, labour and environment, with approximately 5%. As for Europe, they contain a number of subsections. Values so far can be centred on national identity, but also dealing with cultural differences. And yet, even if there were predictions about a polarised election campaign, this might not be the case, at least not all over the European Union. The general share of negative attacks has been in fact only limited to 12% of the classified content. Behind this general figure, we discover large divergences marked in negative appeals depending on the country being observed. In the UK, Netherlands and Malta, there was around 20% of negative campaigning content. On the opposite side, we find Slovenia, Belgium, Germany and Luxembourg, where negative campaigning was almost not visible at all. The targets of the negative campaigns were to a large extent national institutions, politicians and parties with 72% respectively. What can be concluded on this subject is that negative attacks are to be aimed at political opponents, especially on the national level. When candidates and parties decide to maintain a negative perspective, they mostly attack competitors, for example, other political parties in their home country. Hence, around 1/5 of all attacks are directed towards institutions, politicians and parties outside the country with 21%. However, it is not the same type of attacks hiding behind these negative appeals. When negative campaigning goes beyond the country border, parties and politicians alike are not considered the primary target. Instead, we suppose that EU and the Brussels are to be deemed as the main target of the attacks. Only a few attacking messages are directed towards media and also other famous people or associations. Accusations of fake news was never a significant trait during the 2019 elections campaign in Europe, since attacks were directed towards national competitors or the EU as a collective actor, presumably inside the political system. By studying all posters, newspaper ads, television commercials and Facebook posts, we conclude that 67% of all content could show pictures of one or more politicians. One important feature of the 2019 European elections campaign might adhere to show an extensive personalization, which is often discussed in political communication both in positive and negative ways. Just as for other indicators, we have been able to catch some significant differences between the member countries. Around 17 countries could reach a personalization level that is probably higher than average, where Ireland is on the head of the line. Moreover, the Irish campaign contained in 90% of all messages a picture of a politician. In point of fact, no other country has ever had such a personalized campaign, although Slovakia, Croatia and the Baltic states reached high numbers in the personalization scale. In terms of depicting politicians, the least personalized campaign is found in Germany, where only around 1/3 of all content portrays a politician. Luxembourg is by no means an overlooked country, in which the campaign was less personalized than anticipated.